Good afternoon, everybody. Hope everybody is doing well today. Hope everybody can see me. Hope everybody can hear me. I am not a technological savant, so there's always a good possibility I'm doing this incorrectly. But I'm just going to start to roll ahead. Thank you all for joining me. Nothing better than an absolutely glorious day outside to sit inside and learn about some MVAR forms changes. But here we are just the same. For those of you, I know there's a lot of familiar faces who are on here. You can see me, but I can't see you. For those of you that know me, I assure you it is Ryan Stewart. COVID has been tough times, and I've only had Melody to give me a haircut. So this shaggy mop that you see is 3 months of growth. But nonetheless, it is me. Thank you all for joining in, and thank you all again and again for your continued support. For those of you who don't know me, I have managed the Old Town and the Arlington offices of MBH for the past 20 years or so. Seen so many of you at the settlement table over the years, taught classes at NVAR and so forth. And today you get to listen to me for 30 to 35 minutes or so. I want to thank you all. I want to thank you all for all of your flexibility. I know I speak on behalf of all my colleagues when I say this. You all have been incredible. Certainly to us at MBH over the last 25 years, but certainly in the last 3 months or so as we have navigated all of the significant challenges of COVID. And thank you all for supporting your various MBH offices, for supporting the MBH staff as we do our best to keep ourselves happy to keep ourselves healthy so that we can keep your clients healthy and by extension you all healthy, and just continue to do what we do best, which is to get you all to the settlement table. What I want to talk about here today, and what you all tuned in for, of course, are the NVAR standard form changes. And NVAR serves up a steady diet of these form changes on a semi-annual basis. We get them in January typically, and we get them again in July. And I, for one, nobody is more thankful than I am that these changes come out on a semi-annual basis. As I said, for the last 20 years, I've been teaching sales meetings, continuing education classes, mock settlements, new agent trainings, you name it, in your offices. And you wouldn't believe how difficult it is to stay relevant, topical over 20 years when you're in an office 2-3 times a month. I'm always grateful to NVAR for making these changes, if for no other reason that it gives me 2 great topics every year to discuss in these meetings. When I was asked to put on this webinar, my first comment was, let's see what the changes are, because sometimes they're less substantive, sometimes they're more significant. And certainly we can count July 1st of 2020 as one of those windows of time when they are more significant. We're going to see a couple big macro changes as they relate to HOA condo and also to the appraisal contingencies. And while I understand that you may not necessarily embrace these changes like I do, they keep me relevant, they give me something to talk about. For you, this is progress. And this is efficiency, and this is NVAR on your behalf, Virginia legislature on your behalf, addressing the needs of their constituents and addressing the needs of their realtors. And so where you all have said there are problems, they have looked to address them. And I realize that some of these provisions, it's not a perfect contract. Some of it's situational. When we're wearing our hat as a listing agent, we love certain language. And then we're on the opposite side of the table representing the buyer, and we think, boy, this language is terrible. When are they going to get rid of it? Right? Depends on which hat we're wearing. Other areas, they've done their best to address a tough situation. In other areas, NVAR has merely followed the lead of the legislature, which they're obligated to do under Virginia law. So we're going to go through it. We're going to talk about the changes, and hopefully everybody be tracking accordingly. Let me see if I can move my... There we go, PowerPoint. Thanks to NVAR Forms Committee and the members of the Attorney Roundtable. That may seem like lip service, but it really is sincere. I have been on each of these committees at one point or another over my 20 years with MBH, and it is a selfless venture. Again, the goal is only to help you all out, and oftentimes that committee discussion, it can be tough to find some commonality, and they've really done a great job. So while I may be a little critical of some of the changes here today, it comes from nothing but love for everybody on NVAR and the Forms Committee. So let's go ahead and get into it. Let's talk about the changes to the residential sales contract. Now, before we do, right, everybody, let's just take a deep breath, right? Let's find our quan, our comfortable place, right? Because this is not going to change the world for us. I get these calls every time this stuff comes out. People are in a pure panic because the contract is changing. And I get that this is like an old sweater or an old pair of slippers, right? We're comfortable with the contract. Why do you have to mess with a good thing? But if we look back on past iterations of the contract, if we trace back over the last decade plus, all of the changes have gotten us in the right place. Many are designed with efficiency in mind, right? Conformity, commonality, getting everybody on the same place, creating parallelism between contingencies to make your life easier. So these are good changes. These are things that we should welcome with an open mind. If for no other reason, then you have to. It's not going anywhere, and your brokers aren't going to let you use old versions of the contract anyway. All right. Sales contract has been reduced in length. I always put this first because NVAR loves to hang their hat on the length of the contract. When they took it from 16 pages down to 15, greatest thing in the world. Now they've gone from 15 down to 13. So less is more. We're going in the right direction here. Review your offers post July 1st, 2020, right? You can find the form revision down in the bottom left-hand corner of the document. It always tells you what the form number is with the residential sales contract. It's 1359, and you can find the revision number, right? This new one says 720 down in the left-hand corner. The old version of the residential sales contract for Virginia said 719. As a threshold matter, there is nothing wrong with the old version of the sales contract. Just that there's nothing wrong with it last month, and there's nothing wrong with it today or tomorrow. Same is going to be true 2 weeks from now. If you get the world's best offer, all cash, contingency free, above ask, and it's written on a 2019 contract, well, take it, right? There's nothing saying that it's illegal to use an old version of the sales contract. New form is new and improved. Your brokers are going to encourage you to use it. I'm going to encourage you to use it. So try to start to work that into your diet. All right. Let's talk about the substantive changes to the residential sales contract. And this is the big change to the sales contract. It's also the only change to the sales contract. And it's in paragraphs 8 and 9 of the residential sales contract, page 4 and page 5 of the contract. And now I realize that many of you, right, we don't even look at the middle of the contract, right? Pages 1 and 2, we fill in our financing terms and our sales price and our settlement date, and then we just pad all the way down to the end to make sure we got our initials and signatures. There's a lot of meat in the middle of that contract, and notably paragraphs 8 and 9. Properties in a homeowners association for paragraph 8, properties in a condo association for paragraph 9. All right, so this is the new version. All right, if you got your spectacles on, you can see that 720 revision down in the bottom left-hand corner. And this is the new version of the sales contract. So you see what paragraph 8 looks like. You can see paragraph 9 at the bottom, and by and large, it completely mirrors paragraph 8. So paragraph 8 is properties in a homeowners association, Virginia Property Owners Association Act. And for those of you that understand or recognize the old version of the sales contract, this was long. It was dense. It was chewy. It lasted a page and a half for paragraph 8 and a page and a half for paragraph 9, right? And if we look at what's left is only what's in there because it has to be in there. It's a statutory requirement under the POA Act for paragraph 8 and the Condo Act for paragraph 9. And so we see that the statute in paragraph 8A requires the following language, and then verbatim, that's what you've got, right? A disclosure as to whether it's in a homeowners association. A disclosure that it requires the seller to obtain the docs and provide them to the purchaser, that the buyer may cancel, the buyer may request an update. And then we've got this language down at the bottom for delivery of the documents the buyer prefers, an email address if it's electronic or soft copy, and a hard address if it's a hard copy. That's it, right? Nothing more remains, right? Just the streamlined language of the sales contract, right? And that's where we've got the overall shorter length of the sales contract, where you've taken 15 pages and you've dropped it down to 13. It's simply by redacting out all of that superfluous extra language in paragraph 8 and paragraph 9, right? Now, obviously the logical conclusion is, what does that mean, right? Have we dramatically changed the Condo Act or the POA Act? And the answer is no. The answer is that all of that language was simply in there as guidance. It was guidance mostly for buyers to tell them what the Virginia Condominium Act and what the Virginia POA Act allowed them to do. What were their rights under Virginia law? It was summary language. And that summary language has now been taken out of the body of the sales contract, and it's all been put into a new document, right? This is classic NVAR rope-a-dope, right? We're going to take it out. We're going to shout that we've shortened the sales contract to 13 pages, and we're just going to add another document in. Now, that document is Form K-1390. And it's called Understanding Your Rights under the Virginia Condominium Act and Property Owners Association Act, right? It's informational for the buyer. I want to take a quick pause and make sure you see the underlined and the bold language there. This document's optional. It's not part of your sales contract. It's not bilateral, meaning it's not signed by the buyer or the seller. It's not carving out additional rights vis-a-vis the relationship with the buyer or the seller. And as a result, of course, it didn't belong in the sales contract. These were rights that were afforded to the buyer by statute, rights and obligations of both parties that were determined by the statute, and accordingly, no reason to put them into the sales contract and act like we're negotiating them. It's an optional document. That being said, this document is not only recommended, but highly recommended. Your core agency obligation in Virginia, pursuant to the agency code, is to promote your buyers, and for that matter, your sellers' best interests. And one of the ways that you illustrate that you are promoting their best interest is by making them aware of all of the myriad of different considerations. We're going to talk about it with disclosure, and certainly that's true here with HOA and condo. And if you're not using this document, if you're not having your buyers sign off and acknowledge it, well, they could make the argument that they never knew. And as a result, you were negligent. You didn't exercise a duty of care in representing their best interests, right? And as a result, you may expose yourself to a potential claim with DPOR or NVAR. So I highly recommend that you use this document, put it in front of your buyers, have them sign off on it. I'm anticipating that your brokers will require this. All right, here's the document. Here's what it looks like. You see, it's a 4-page document, Understanding Your Rights under the Act. Paragraph 1, first properties in a condominium. It tells you what a resale certificate should contain. And it's those 19 requirements that are detailed in the Virginia law that states that any condominium resale certificate has to have all of the following information: the bylaws, the covenants, the budgets, right? All the recent meeting minutes, on and on they go. Paragraph 2 is for properties in a homeowners association. It tells you that a disclosure packet has to have the same 19 requirements. All of this is Virginia law. We're telling you this in the first 2 pages of this document. Pages 3 and 4 all talk about buyer's right to cancellation, right? Talks about the buyer actually receiving the disclosure packet of the resale certificate. Talks about the time frame to cancel. Talks about requesting an update. Speaks to what happens if the disclosure packet of the resale certificate is deemed to not be available, right? This paragraph 3, pages 3 and 4 of this document is everything that used to be incorporated in paragraphs 8 and 9 of the sales contract that have been poached out of that document, modified slightly, and now put into this document as simply a disclosure, an informational document to the buyer, right? And so we see all 4 pages of it, and sure enough, it's just for the buyer to sign, right? Buyer just acknowledges that they've received it, not a required addendum in your sales contract, not an addendum at all, and doesn't require seller signature. All right, let's look at some of the highlights of this document. Again, we're still on this 4-page document, Understanding Your Rights. As I've said, it merely reiterates all the provisions and protections outlined in the Act. And the highlights of it. As I just referenced, paragraph 1B, resale certificate should contain. Paragraph 2B, disclosure packet should contain. There's that language for you again. Now, my question to you is, does that look familiar? Right? Anybody recognize all of these different provisions and where you've seen them before, right? It should look familiar to you. And it should look familiar because it's already part of an NVAR document. And it's part of NVAR Form K-1025 for properties in a condo association and 1126 for properties in a homeowners association. This is that buyer's acknowledgement of receipt of the resale certificate or the disclosure package. And that document, when it would come about in your transaction, wasn't something that was disclosed to the buyer up front, right? This wasn't an informational document provided to them prior to ratification, but rather they would get their documents. They get the HOA or the condo documents, and either the selling agent or the listing agent would say, well, buyer, let's go ahead and have you acknowledge receipt of the documents. It was never required in the Act to acknowledge receipt, but we're all good about dotting our I's. And so this particular form, 1025 or 1126, whether you're in a condo association or a homeowners association, would be put in front of a buyer. And the buyer would take a look at their documents, right? And while that document was acknowledging receipt, what it was also saying is that I acknowledge receipt of the HOA or condo documents that contains all of the following 19 provisions. And the buyer, of course, would acknowledge receipt, but they would find it incumbent upon themselves that they needed to go through the HOA or the condo documents to make sure that they'd gotten what they were attesting to receiving. Well, I see the bylaws and I see the covenants. I've got meeting minutes here, but these are 90 days old. We're the most recent meeting minutes. And the next thing you know, the buyer is completely auditing the HOA or condo documents pursuant to this form that you've given them or the listing agent has given them. And they're coming back at you. And they're saying it's not complete. I don't have a complete set of documents. And pursuant to this notion of equity, I should get a complete set. And until I get a complete set, the clock isn't ticking. I still have a right to cancel. And I would get this question all the time from agents in this scenario. Now, we talked about it. It's now been incorporated into this informational form to buyers. And so as a result, these forms have now been removed from the NVAR forms library. All right. Now, my response to that is ecstatic, right? I'm jumping up and down over this because I would get this call all the time. Because either listing agents or selling agents would fall into the same trap. They would provide this form trying to allow their buyer to acknowledge receipt, trying to dot the I, but lo and behold, what would result would be this Pandora's box, where the buyer would assert they didn't have a complete set of documents, the clock wasn't ticking, both parties were circling around trying to get the buyer a complete set. The question was whether they still had the right to cancel, rights to an update, how quickly it would come. And it was just a disaster. And so NVAR, perhaps indirectly, has solved that problem because now the buyer is not seeing that document at the point of reviewing the documents, but rather they're seeing it very early on as a disclosure. Now, you may think that's good and you may think that's bad, but the goal of getting your transactions to the settlement table, it's going to be one major hurdle you're going to be able to circumvent. And so it leads us to this question: what are the buyer's rights if the certificate or the disclosure packet is incomplete? What if I've only got 10 of the 19 requirements under the Act? And long ago, the Virginia courts opined upon this, and they said that an incomplete package was just as good as a complete package for purposes of a seller satisfying their obligation under the Act. That it's not the seller's responsibility to audit the association to make sure they give a complete package, but rather it's the seller's responsibility to request the documents from the association and whatever they get, to provide it to the purchaser. And the Virginia courts further opined that if the buyer doesn't like it, well, they have two remedies. The one is to request an update, and the second is to cancel the contract. And so we're not going to shed a tear and put the burden on the seller to oversee the association for completeness, but rather just provide the documents to the buyer. All right? Now, this too has been added into this form because there was always that sense of uncertainty. Disclosing to a buyer up front that what you see is what you get. And so it says in that form 1390 that the buyer's right of cancellation begins upon seller delivery of the resale certificate, and it includes a resale certificate or disclosure packet that is not in conformity with the provisions of the Act. Again, boiled down, distilled, an incomplete set of documents is just as good as a complete set of documents for purposes of satisfying the Act. Now, what does a buyer do then when they get an incomplete set of documents? They don't want to cancel. They want to get a complete set. And so it leads me to the second question. If for any reason a buyer wants or needs more than 3 days to review the documents, can that time period be extended? And all the way up until July 1st of 2020, that answer was a definitive no. That while we could get kind of original and use sort of a general contingency to perhaps extend this window of time, that what we couldn't do under the POA Act or the Condominium Act was to say that rather than 3 days to review, we all agree that the buyer has 6 days or 7 days to review, right? Because there's language in the Act that says specifically the buyer has 3 days to cancel from receipt or 6 days from the postmark date. There's further language in the Act that states that the rights and obligations conferred upon the parties may not be augmented by separate agreement among the parties, which is to say that if we paper an addendum that says we've got 6 days instead of 3 days, it's unenforceable. The time period cannot be extended under the terms of the current POA Act or the Condominium Act. Well, what I anticipate was that this concern was vocalized consistently to congressmen, to the realtor associations. And all of a sudden, it got on the Virginia floor, on the Virginia legislature to be addressed. And so now we see, in addition to streamlining it, paragraphs 8 and paragraph 9 of the residential sales contract all include language for allowing the extension of the right to cancel. You've got this language in paragraphs 8 and 9 that states that the purchaser may cancel the contract within 3 days or up to 7 days if extended by the ratified real estate contract after receiving the documents, right? This opportunity up to 7 days to cancel the contract. Now, how is it extended? It's extended by the ratified real estate contract, and there is no place in the new residential sales contract to extend it. We could go back to it or take a look at it. There's no little blank that says we are going to extend it up to 5 days, 6 days, 7 days, right? There's no place in there. What there is there's language in paragraphs 8 and 9 that states that pursuant to the act and pursuant for purposes of this paragraph, the ratified real estate contract includes any addenda to this contract. And so while you could extend the window of time to review in paragraph 41, which is other terms, what is contemplated by the legislature and what is contemplated by NVAR is that you'll extend it with a separate addendum. And there is an addendum that has been created. And it is again referenced in Form K-1390. That's our understanding our rights. And it states that the parties may extend the buyer's right of cancellation by ratifying, and we've got this new document now. I'll show it to you momentarily. It's called the Extension of Review Period for Condominium Resale Certificate Property Owners Association Disclosure Packet Addendum, right? A mouthful there, right? And that is the new document that has been created by NVAR to be used to extend the window of time for a buyer to cancel under POA Act or the Condo Act. And I know you all like acronyms, right? Home Inspection Contingency Removal Addendum is the HICRA, Residential Sales Contract, you know, the RSC, right? We've got all sorts of them, POA Act for Property Owners Association Act. And so this one, I took the liberty there. It's the ERPC RCPOA, right? That's the ERPCRPODPA. I think it's catchy, right? All right. So this is the benefit of me not seeing you. I can probably bomb on my humor, and yet not only can I anticipate you all are in stitches laughing, there's no Rotten Tomatoes to throw at me. All right, very good. So this is what it looks like. All right, this is the new extension of review period for condominium resale certificate. And you'll see that it's got boxes that can be checked, right? It's an addendum made to the sales contract between buyer and seller. If we're going to extend our rights under homeowners association, we check the first box. Extend under condominium association, we check the second box. And you'll see the language states that the parties agree that the buyer's right to cancellation shall be extended by blank days. And the parenthetical states that the total extension shall not exceed 4 days. So let's say the buyer anticipates or needs additional time. They're going to put a number of days in that blank. We'll just for argument's sake say that's 4 days because that is the maximum amount of days that they could put in there. And in doing so, we would be extending our right to cancel. Was 3 days, we add our 4 days, so a total of 7 days from actual receipt, hand delivery of the documents. It was 6 days from postmark date, so now 10 days from the postmark date. We're extending that window of time by whatever number of days we have in that blank. Okay. Couple of important considerations here. The first one is the most important. This is not a required form for every transaction. We are fresh off the heels or perhaps still in the wake of COVID. And NVAR scratched their head, they put together that COVID addendum, and they did so to address the concerns of parties that needed that relief. I don't know what COVID is going to look like. I don't know what it's going to look like with my job, with my income. So I want a document that essentially says I can walk if something unforeseen happens. What resulted, of course, was that every buyer there for a couple of weeks was throwing a COVID addendum into their sales contract. And I tried to scream from the mountaintops, this is not a document for every transaction. I'm making the same cry here. This is not something that you put into every single one of your contract offers. We're not automatically looking to extend every single right to cancel from 3 days up to 7 days. This is one that is situation specific. And most assuredly, extending that date is buyer friendly. Anytime we're extending a window of time to cancel, a unilateral window for the buyer, right? That's a buyer friendly term. Sellers are going to want to see it stay at 3 days. And so particularly now in our low inventory, multiple offer, very competitive environment, buyers are probably discouraged from using this form, right? If 3 days was good enough last week and last year, it's going to be good enough next week and next year. So don't include the addendum in your contract. It's also an addendum. This isn't something unilateral where I, as a buyer, can simply just reach out and say, you know what, I think I'm going to need 5 days. So here you go. This is not a notice. This is an addendum. So we need the seller's agreement on it. It is a document that could be included with the original offer. And in fact, the sales contract in the additions paragraph does allow a yes or no box for this document to be included. Perhaps, in my opinion, unfortunate that it's suggesting that it should be in there. The great majority of your contracts, I believe, should still have a no checked for that box, that we're not including this extension. But if for whatever reason the buyer thought they're definitely going to need the additional time, right? I've been told this is 150 pages. I'm a very slow reader. No way I get that done in 3 days. And put it into your sales contract. But where I think it was truly contemplated, and the reason that I think the legislature changed the POA Act and the Condo Act, is for something to be proffered post-ratification. That you get this incomplete set of HOA or condo documents. That you request an update from the association on day 2, and they tell you, well, it's going to be 2 days and we'll have it back to you. And the buyer says, well, I don't want to cancel, but I'm really unsure about this incomplete set of documents. I really want to review this update. And so, seller, would you be willing to give me an extra 2 days so that I can get the update back and feel the surety that I need in buying this property? And as a result, the buyer would provide this extension to the seller. Ostensibly, the seller would sign it so as not to have the buyer cancel the contract, and maybe the parties go forward. But I think that's kind of what the legislature was contemplating. But if you don't like it, save your tomatoes for your congressman. This is not something NVAR did. Paragraphs 8 and paragraphs 9 are merely a memorialization of Virginia law. It's got nothing to do with NVAR. All right? Very good. All right. So the sales contract was updated, paragraphs 8 and 9. Similarly, the sales contract for unimproved land and new home construction, they also have provisions for properties in a homeowners association. They have updated that language to mimic or parallel the same language in the residential sales contract. That's Forms K 1209 and 1208. Okay, so that's the change to HOA and condo. We're halfway home. Now let's talk about the financing contingency addenda, because this is the other macro change that you're going to see as of July 1st, 2020. And all of our financing contingency addenda have been modified. So FHA, conventional, VA, USDA, all have been adjusted. We talked about our form revisions. These are all 720, just like the residential sales contract. None of the financing addenda have been revised since this time last year, so all the old ones are saying 719. Again, there's nothing illegal. There's nothing wrong with the old versions, but we are going to encourage you to use the new version. And certainly that's what's going to be in your forms library and auto contract and so forth. And the most significant change, as I mentioned, relates to the appraisal contingency. And while they've been changed for all of the formats, it's conventional that has changed the most. And the goal among all of the different financing contingency was to parallel the framework of the home inspection contingency, right? And the goal here is 100% purely for you all, right? There's so much you guys got to deal with. Maybe you're licensed in Maryland, DC, and Virginia. That's 3 different contracts. You've got different contingencies for financing, appraisal, home inspection. You've got different rates for HOA and condo, right? It's difficult, right? It's tough to figure all that stuff out. And I, for one, am thankful because that gives me relevancy. You can call me and I can help you out on all of those things. But the goal is to create some efficiency for you. The goal is to make your life easier, and in hopes of providing some parallelism that you don't have as many different frameworks to understand. And so what they've done with the conventional appraisal contingency is to really closely parallel the home inspection contingency. I think this will look kind of familiar to you. So take a look at page 2 of the conventional financing contingency. Paragraph 5 is the appraisal contingency. The great majority of this is going to look familiar, right? This isn't a whole scale modification to it, right? We see that the contract is or is not contingent on appraisal. We see the same appraisal deadline. You got until 9 p.m. They still recommend 21 days. I'd recommend 28 to 30 for FHA or VA, right? And then you've got this requirement of the buyer to deliver to the seller prior to the appraisal contingency deadline an appraisal contingency notice, right? They've changed the order here to make it a little bit more efficient. So if you're really comparing apples to apples, it's going to look a little bit different. But A, B, C, and D, these are the same options that existed under the old version of the contingency addendum, minor revision to D. So A, right? I send my notice. I say, hey, the property appraised. We're moving forward. No issue. B, right? B used to be D. It's been moved up. But now it says, hey, I don't care whether it's appraised or not. I'm moving forward. No issue. We've got no issue with the sales price. We're not concerned with appraisal. The contingency has been removed, right? C. C says the property appraises at equal to or greater than the sales price. But for whatever reason, I can't go forward because my financing has been declined as a result of the collateral, right? It's inadequate collateral. It does not meet the lender's requirements, right? This sort of niche paragraph that exists where it's not the individual who's rejected for the financing, but essentially the property that's rejected for the financing, even though it does meet the appraisal. Okay? And then D. D is where we start to see some change. The old version of the appraisal contingency said that if I get notification of a low appraisal and I don't want to proceed forth at the sales price, I provide the seller notice accordingly, right? I'm not proceeding forth at the sales price, to which the seller then has the option of reducing it down to the appraised value. If the seller declines to reduce it down to the appraised value, then it states that the parties can negotiate a mutually agreeable sales price. Failure to come to an agreement, the contract's void, and gives all this language about 3 days back and forth and responding to offer and counteroffer. That's been changed. So what we now have is a scenario in which the property doesn't appraise, right? I got a $500,000 sales price. Property appraises at $490,000. So I send my appraisal contingency notice with the language in D. And the language in D says it appraised at less than the sales price. I'm not going forward unless the seller elects to lower the sales price. I include a copy of the appraisal. And then it says, and setting forth the buyer's proposed sales price, which shall not be lower than the appraised value of the home. So here's that appraisal contingency notice. And again, I'm assuming that we're selecting the bottom box. The appraisal is less than the sales price. I'm not proceeding forth unless the seller elects to lower the sales price to blank. So our $500,000 property had appraised at $490,000. That number has to be no lower than $490,000. But ostensibly, if the buyer said, well, I don't want to shake the seller down that much, and I really could go to $495,000, well, the buyer doesn't have to ask the seller to go right to the appraised value. They could say, unless the seller elects to lower the sales price to $495,000. One quick aside. You'll notice this document, it's been prepared like an addendum. That was a mistake with the educational versions that came out. I've made a note here that this is actually a notice, right? It's not an addendum. My recommendation to you was to strike the place for the seller to sign. This is just simply a notice, a unilateral document, the buyer reaching out to the seller to say, hey, look, I don't want to go forth unless you lower the sales price. I have talked to NVAR about an hour ago. The version that is released on July 1st will actually be a notice. So don't get lost in the weeds like I did on that. All right. Okay. So I send over my notice. It appraised at $490,000. I'm not proceeding forth. As an aside, I can't imagine why any buyer in their right mind would ever include a sales price that wasn't the appraised value, right? It appraised at $490,000. I offered $500,000. Why would I say I'll go forth if you pay $495,000? I might as well go all the way, walk it all the way down to the appraised value. But nonetheless, it contemplates that I could do something different. I send that notice over to the buyer. And here's where we see our parallelism to the home inspection contingency. Now we go in to a negotiation period. Just like in home inspection, I send my home inspection report, I send my home inspection contingency removal addendum, and the moment I deliver it, we have a negotiation period, a window of time where buyers and sellers can come to some commonality. And just like home inspection, we see with appraisal that we have this window of time. I'm anticipating you probably have 3 days in here. 3 days after delivery to come up with a mutually agreeable sales price. And just like home inspection, you can go back and forth, making as many offers, counter offers, modifying, rescinding, you name it as you choose, so long as you find commonality on the sales price during that negotiation period. And assuming that an agreement is met, at that point, the parties would then draft an addendum. Appraisal contingency has been removed. The sales price is amended to $495,000. What happens in home inspection when we don't come to an agreement during the negotiation period? We get to the buyer's election period, right? This window of time where the buyer can void the contract. A certain number of days that the buyer has the unilateral right at that point to void, and should nothing happen during that window of time, only then is the contingency removed. The contract remains in effect at the original sales price. So the trickle down of this, I think almost every low appraisal was probably negotiated by buyers and sellers. Nonetheless, the old version of the sales contract, for those that had taken my contracts classes, I always said that the buyer didn't have a free volley over to the seller, meaning that the buyer, under the old version of the appraisal contingency, could say, hey, I'm not moving forward at 500. Seller can lower it down to 490. If we don't come to an agreement, then the contract's void. And so ostensibly the seller could say, hey, perfect, thanks for sending that notice. Not only am I not reducing it down to 490, but we're not coming to an agreement. I got a better offer, or I got cold feet. I don't want to sell it to you. I just don't like you, whatever the case. And the buyer could potentially lose the contract by trying to negotiate a low appraisal. That option no longer exists under this new version of the appraisal contingency. Because I, as a buyer, remember under that contingency notice, I'm going to say, hey, drop it down to a sales price not less than 490. And then we go into the negotiation phase, but I know I've always got the soft landing of this buyer's election period. That even if we can't come to an agreement, I always have the option to circle back and take it at the original sales price as part of the buyer's election period. So there isn't that disincentive for a buyer for negotiating an appraisal contingency. Low appraisal, buyers are always going to negotiate. At the end of the day as well, I've always recommended that agents verbally negotiate low appraisals. There's no point in getting this clock started. Selling agents, call up the listing agent, say, hey, look, it appraised at 490. My buyer can't go any higher. You know, if your seller can drop it down, we'll move forward. If not, let's just go ahead and void the contract now, right? Work all that out back and forth verbally as opposed to sending addenda back and forth. And so this does create a little smoother version of that, but nonetheless, I'd still recommend pick up the phone and talk to the other agent. Use your expertise. That's why they've hired you in this transaction. All right. FHA, VA, USDA. These financing contingency addenda have all been amended as well as it relates to the appraisal provisions, or what I've sort of colloquially called the appraisal contingencies. It doesn't quite set up the same framework. And it doesn't set up the same framework only because government-backed loans, by statute, by federal law, the purchaser always has the right to void following a low appraisal. And so there's new language in the sales contract that essentially contemplates those same notices. It still gives the parties the ability to offer, counteroffer, modify, rescind as many offers as they choose during what is, I guess, styled a negotiation period, although they don't call it, it just says negotiation. But nonetheless, the buyer always retains throughout that entire window of time, all the way up to settlement, or until the buyer and seller have executed a new addendum, removing the contingency and modifying the sales price. The buyer could always, anytime up to that, just simply void. They're getting FHA, VA, or USDA financing. Right. As a quick aside, though this is not a change, do remember when your buyers are trying to make competitive offers, they can't waive the appraisal provisions under these government-backed loans. That is a federal protection that is afforded to buyers. The lenders are going to require that mandatory language to be in the sales contract. So there's no point in following with it. It's not enforceable. It's going to end up needing to be in your contract one way or the other. All right. We made it through the change in the residential sales contract. We made it through the change in the financing addenda. Let's talk about a few miscellaneous changes. Residential Property Disclosure Act. Form K-1346, Understanding Your Rights and Responsibilities under the Residential Property Disclosure Act. This form is now gone. It's been removed from the forms library. And the reason is twofold, and I think it's still a little nebulous at this point. But effective July 1st of 2020, right, Residential Property Disclosure Act has changed. And this is a very subtle, it's a semantics change, but it's a change just the same. And it's going to require that the buyers affirm that they have been advised of the disclosures in the Residential Property Disclosure Act. Now that may seem like what they've always attested to, but the old language is that they've been advised to review the disclosures. And this is a subtle nuance, but I think it is a big one for selling agents. Remember that your core agency obligation is to adhere to Virginia law and to promote the best interests of your buyers. Virginia is a notoriously caveat emptor or buyer beware state. In other words, there's not much that a seller is disclosing to a buyer, that the burden is on the buyer to do their due diligence for just about everything in Virginia. And up until July 1st of 2020, the burden on the selling agent is to advise their buyers to review the link that takes them to DPOR's website that details all the representations and warranties that the seller is not making in the Residential Property Disclosure Statement. The new version of it doesn't say I've been advised to review it, but rather I've been advised of the disclosures. And again, that may seem like semantics, but to me it puts much more of a burden on selling agents to make sure that each of those disclosures have been put out in some sort of written form in front of our buyers. And further, I anticipate that the Residential Property Disclosure Statement, in which a seller directs the buyer to the website, and then also now signed by the buyer, I will anticipate that the buyers are going to have to attest that they have not only been advised to review these disclosures, but have actually reviewed the disclosures. That's a bunch of mumbo jumbo, but that's our legislature at its best. And further, DPOR has not put out a revised form yet. So kudos to NVAR for making adjustments. DPOR has yet to amend the Residential Property Disclosure Statement. And what I sincerely hope is that we don't have a repeat of what we had a couple of years ago, where DPOR and the legislature changed the Residential Property Disclosure Act. We didn't know whether it was a one-page disclosure statement, a two-page, a three-page, and we were unsure whether our contracts had even been ratified because we hadn't provided a proper disclosure statement. More to come on that. That is certainly something we'll be following up on in the next week, and I would encourage you to reach out to your MBH managers and have a conversation about, because I do think that is the one stone that still remains unturned in light of this change. Enough about that. In addition, there are previous representations, I've said, or lack thereof, right? We all know in Virginia that I, as a seller, tell you as the buyer that I'm not telling you anything about the condition of the property, right? I'm disclosing to you that I'm not disclosing squat to you, right? And this whole laundry list of things that I'm not telling you about, right? Property in a historic district, Megan's Law, adjacent parcels, you name it. The list is 11 or 12 deep. Well, now it's 17 or 18 deep. You've got additional representations and warranties. The seller is telling the buyer, I'm not telling you anything about marine clay, not telling you anything about radon, building energy analysis, whatever the heck that is, defective drywall, dams, or lead pipes. None of those things I'm telling you about. If you have concerns, buyer, go figure it out for yourself. Important to distinguish lead pipes from lead-based paint. We do still have the federal EPA protections for lead-based paint that a seller must disclose if they have actual knowledge. But lead pipes, no requirement in Virginia. A couple of lease provisions, and I will be the first to tell you I am not a landlord-tenant expert. We at MBH handle residential real property transactions, sales, so I am not a landlord-tenant expert, but there have been changes for those of you that do rentals, the VRLTA lease, which now is essentially the only lease now that the common law has become so similar to the VRLTA that NVR essentially did away with the common law lease. But the VRLTA lease has changes in paragraphs 2, 5, and 19. The lease renewal change relates to coming to an agreement to renew within 60 days prior. Late charges detail the amount of late charges that can be assessed to a tenant. And then a return of security deposit relates to a 45-day window that I have to return it from the termination of the lease. Check it out. I'm not the guy to go through it, but I make you aware of it. Virginia Fair Housing Act has also been amended. In addition to all of the federal protections, in addition to the previous Virginia protections, the protected classes, they have added source of funds, sexual orientation, gender identity, and veteran status to the protected classes. To that end, the exclusive right to lease listing agreement has also been modified. The old version of paragraph 5 allowed for landlords to check the box, yes or no, whether I will consider applications from prospective tenants who qualify for Section 8. The new law in Virginia is that if the landlord owns more than 4 rental dwelling units in Virginia, either under their name or any LLC in which they have, I believe, a 10% interest, that they must consider applications from prospective tenants. So now the box is, do you own 4 or more? If yes, then you must consider applications from prospective tenants who qualify for Section 8. Our very last point relates to the transfer taxes in Virginia. I've gotten a handful of questions about this. For all deeds recorded on or after July 1st, 2020. So these are for your sellers closing in the afternoon on June 30th or any time going forward. It's going to cost them more to sell in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Additional transfer taxes are being charged in Northern Virginia. Everybody remembers the regional congestion relief fee. This was a number of years ago that the Virginia legislature delegated the taxing authority to the Transportation Department. And they added an additional $4 per thousand congestion relief fee. And it was a complete disaster because it was challenged as upheld as being unconstitutional. All the money had to be returned to sellers. In the wake of that, a year or two later, they added the WMATA fee. The WMATA fee is charged in the city of Alexandria, Arlington County, Fairfax County, Prince William County, and Loudoun County. And now in all of those jurisdictions, they are also adding a regional congestion relief fee equal to 50 cents per thousand in the greater of the sales price or the assessed value. So when you're doing your net sheets, real easy for your sellers. They're going to pay $3 per thousand in the greater of the sales price or the assessed value. And of course, typically that's the sales price. Take your sales price, multiply by 3, $3 per thousand. That's what they're going to pay in Virginia. $1 grantor's tax, $1.50 WMATA, and 50-cent congestion relief fee. The one other question that has been broached to me a number of times, the Virginia Code, when it created the WMATA tax, also said that the grantor tax and the WMATA fee would be paid by the seller. And so effectively in every transaction, even REO, short sale, you name it, even if the seller was looking to shift the financial burden of all the other costs, the seller would retain and pay the cost of the grantor's tax and the WMATA fee. I don't think that was really ever the intent. If the parties want to agree to it, the buyer can pay all the costs. They can pay all the taxes. If the sellers want to agree to it, they can pay all the costs. They can pay all the taxes. It's a matter of contract. And it's not statutory as to who pays what. So if the buyer and the seller sign a contract that states that the grantor's tax is going to be paid by the buyer, well, that's perfectly valid under Virginia law. And that little modification has now been changed in the code. I think the concern that I got was that all of a sudden we were going to look like Maryland. And in Maryland, you've got this provision in a number of counties where it details that the transfer taxes will be paid split 50-50, or the buyer will pay all of them, or the seller will pay all of them. To my knowledge, NVAR is not contemplating any change like that. The boilerplate of the sales contract still has the buyer pay for the recordation of the deed and the deed of trust. It has the seller pay for the grantor's tax, the WMATA, and the congestion relief fee. So the boilerplate will still keep us in our traditional industry standard payments. If you want to augment those, perfectly legal to do so in the Commonwealth of Virginia. All right, guys, I advertised 35, 40 minutes. Not sure exactly where I'm at, maybe a little longer. I tend to be a little long-winded. In closing, if you have questions or concerns, and I'm sure there are a handful, I'll try to get to them. I'll try to get back in touch with you. You can certainly reach out to me individually, but that's what your MBH attorneys and your MBH settlement agents are out there for. I would encourage you to reach out and call them. We've got 20 offices in Virginia, DC, and Maryland. We handle closings in all of those jurisdictions. And make no mistake, I love to educate you guys. I love to get out there. I love to help you, make you better agents, do better jobs. But I do this for a living. I hope to see you at the settlement table, and I know all of my colleagues at my fellow MBH offices would encourage you to do the same. So we look forward to continuing that wonderfully symbiotic relationship with you. We've been doing it for 25 years now. We look forward to doing it for 25 more. And we just truly look forward to seeing you at the settlement table. So be safe, be well, be prosperous. I'll see you soon.